On September the 6th, 2017, Hurricane Irma devastated the Caribbean island of Barbuda. For the first time in 300 years, the island was left uninhabited, apart from the dogs and the other animals left behind by a fleeing population. Irma was just one of a string of powerful hurricanes sweeping through the Caribbean and across the southern states of the US in 2017 in one of the most destructive hurricane seasons on record. And as one storm after the next battered communities, it challenged them to think about what it means to be resilient in the face of such devastation. Resiliency, I have to admit, is a bit of a buzzword these days. In the environmental context, it's often used to describe how readily an ecosystem is able to resist harm or cover from damage caused by some event. But resiliency goes far beyond resistance to change. In its broader sense, it gets to the heart of how we think about what's important to us and how we make provisions to protect and grow this in spite of events that threaten to cause harm. Long before I became involved with environmental sustainability, I was used to the idea of resilience that's commonly used in materials science. Here, resilience is a measure of how much energy a material can absorb and still have the ability to return to its previous state when the energy is released. Imagine, for instance, a rubber band. If it's stretched and as long as it doesn't break and it's not old and weathered, it'll return to its original shape once released. In this way, it's resilient to change, but push it too far and it'll snap. There's a limit to how resilient it is. This idea of resiliency as an ability to return to normalcy in the face of stress is how it's often used to describe ecosystems. Resilient ecosystems are frequently seen as those that resist permanent damage and that recover fast if they're harmed. But in a world where change is the driving force behind pretty much everything, this turns out to be a rather limited concept. Despite change and adaptation being the bedrock of our planet's biological and geological evolution, ideas of environmental resiliency seem too easily to slip into a mode of thinking that suggests change is bad and should be resisted. This is understandable if we believe that we should be preserving how things are or some ideal of how they should be. But it's important to ask what we're trying to preserve here. Is it the global environment as it now stands? Is it how we as humans are currently living? Is it the continuation of life in some form? Or is it the continuation of some future version of humanity? In reality, how we think about resiliency depends entirely on what we're trying to protect and preserve. And this, it turns out, is deeply dependent on context, to the extent that ideas that look like resilient approaches from one perspective may look highly precarious from another. In effect, our understanding of resilience depends on what's important to us. And in this context, resilience is not necessarily about maintaining the status quo, but about protecting and preserving what is considered to be of value. This may be the environment or our health and well-being, but it may just as equally be someone's ability to make a living or their deeply held beliefs or even their sense of self-identity and worth. From this perspective, we can begin to think of resiliency as something we use to protect many different types of value within society or to ensure that this value can be regained if it's temporarily damaged. Thinking about resiliency in this way ends up with it being less about maintaining what we currently have and more about ensuring future outcomes that we value. It also helps illuminate the complex landscape around issues like climate change, where different and sometimes hidden values may be threatened. And with this reframing, we have a concept that is, in itself, adaptable to a changing world. It's a way of thinking about resiliency that moves our focus from maintaining our environment as we think it should be to considering where we want to be, even as the environment around us changes. This begins to get close to a perspective on resilience proposed by Tom Seeger and colleagues back in 2013. Thinking specifically about engineered systems, they explored the idea of resilience as being about what a system does rather than what it is. In the language of value, this translates to resilience being about developing systems that preserve what we consider to be valuable rather than simply describing the system itself. It's all about getting to where we want to be rather than simply trying to stay in the same place. This broader understanding of resilience is described rather well by David Woods in a 2015 paper and expanded on later by Seeger and others. Woods describes 4 types of resilience. First, there's rebound, or the ability for a system to return to its healthy state after being damaged. This is pretty close to the standard understanding of ecological resilience. Then there's robustness, or the ability to withstand knocks and shocks without failing. Things get interesting, though, with the third type of resilience, graceful extensibility. Wood's notion of graceful extensibility recognizes that no matter how prepared you are, there will always be surprises, and it's always good to be able to adapt to them. It's a bit like the blade of grass bending but not being swept away by the hurricane, while stronger but less resilient trees are uprooted. Wood's final type of resiliency is sustained adaptability, or a willingness to change and sacrifice some aspects of what already exists in order to maintain others. Again, this begins to frame the idea of resiliency as less about maintaining the status quo and more about adapting to change while preserving what's important. These 4 types of resiliency still have the feel of trying to maintain things as they are, but they do acknowledge that some willingness to change and adapt and have some degree of flexibility is necessary. I'd go further, though, and argue that because we live in a world where change is the lifeblood of everything, we need to understand how to live with change. This includes the surprises, failures, and changes that make life tough, but it also includes changes that make life easier if we can just see how to take advantage of them. What's important here is not trying to maintain what we have or what we believe we should have simply because we have it, but protecting what we think is truly important. Not surprisingly, the list of what we collectively think is important is a long and often conflicting one. But building resiliency to protect and preserve what we can agree should be protected and preserved in a changing world makes a lot of sense, and this brings us back to the day after tomorrow. On one level, the day after tomorrow can be viewed as a movie about the dangers of not building resilient systems. In the movie, political decision-making lacks the resiliency to prevent human-driven climate change, and infrastructure systems lack the resiliency to withstand the impacts of extreme storms. What we see is a brittle world collapsing under the consequences of ill-considered decisions. And yet, for all the dramatic and catastrophic change in the movie, people, relationships, and nations survive. Not only do they survive, they grow and adapt, and ultimately they show deep resiliency in the face of potential catastrophe. This, though, is a matter of framing. Certainly, the developed world and its institutions and infrastructures are shattered by the catastrophic shift in global climate. But in the movie's narrative, what is important to the central characters, including love, commitment, friendship, and selflessness, are resilient in the face of the onslaught. And because of this, despite the on-screen destruction, this is a movie about hope for the future, a hope that's based on the resiliency of the human spirit. That said, this is very much a privileged Western perspective. Despite the shock we feel at seeing whole communities decimated in the movie, this is sadly not an unusual state of affairs as you look around the world. Beyond the confines of a Western middle-class existence, suffering and catastrophe are commonplace, whether through war, famine, disease, poverty, climate, or a whole host of other factors. And this is perhaps one of the more sobering takeaways from the movie, that while we might talk about the need for resiliency in the face of climate change, communities around the world are exhibiting resiliency now every day as they struggle to survive and find meaning in a fickle world. For many of these communities, resiliency is not about holding on to what they have, but about not letting go of who they are. Yet in many cases, this is a necessity rather than a virtue, and one that should probably not be praised where it shouldn't be needed. And this brings us to a final way of thinking about resiliency. Resiliency should not be about survival or about holding on to life with our fingernails. Rather, it should be about having the ability to thrive in a changing world. Yet to achieve this, we need to be proactive. We need to have foresight and to act with intention if we want to create the future we desire, in spite of what the dynamic and dangerous world we live in throws at us. This means taking responsibility for changes that we can control, such as reducing the chances of catastrophic climate change that's driven by our own irresponsible actions. But it could just as easily mean using technology to intentionally modify the Earth's climate. And this brings us to an idea that isn't explicitly addressed in The Day After Tomorrow, but is deeply embedded in how we think about resiliency, climate, and the future: geoengineering.